Okay, so today we're diving deep into conflict strategy, specifically the work of Thomas C. Schelling and his book, The Strategy of Conflict.
Yeah, this book, it came out in 1960 and then had this really insightful preface added in 1980. It's amazing how relevant it still is for understanding, how strategy works.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we've pulled out excerpts that really get to the core of Schelling's thinking.
Yeah, we're looking at his framework for strategic thinking, how bargaining works, the huge role of communication, and, the often weird nature of limited war.
It's kind of like a concentrated dose of strategic wisdom, even for those who might be familiar with these ideas already.
Right, exactly.
And what's super interesting is Schelling wasn't just writing for, academics. He wanted his ideas to be useful for anyone dealing with real-world strategy problems. He even hoped that the formal stuff in game theory could be applied to these messy real-world situations.
Yeah, that was a big goal of his, to bring that theoretical rigor to practical problems.
Speaking of practical problems, let's jump into the first chapter, which has a pretty provocative title, The Retarded Science of International Strategy.
Yeah, that title definitely grabs your attention, doesn't it? And it kind of reflects Schelling's main point, which is that the study of conflict often misses this really crucial element, how deeply interdependent all the decisions are.
So it's not just about one person making a choice, it's about everyone's actions, and more importantly, their expectations of what others will do.
Exactly. And that's what really shapes the whole situation.
He's basically criticizing this tendency to look at conflict as just this breakdown of the normal order, like a pathological state,
Yeah.
instead of seeing it as a process, even if it's dangerous, where everyone involved, whether they're rational or not, is trying to win something.
Right. And winning, in Schelling's view, it's not always about like total military victory.
Yeah, it's much broader than that.
Right. It can be all sorts of things.
So this strategy of conflict, it's really about this whole interplay of decisions and expectations, right?
Mm.
And that brings us to the idea of deterrence, which Schelling saw as like a fundamental part of strategy.
Absolutely. Deterrence is key.
And, we hear about deterrence all the time when people talk about international security and
Oh,
stuff.
for sure. It's everywhere.
And Schelling was thinking about this early on. He was looking at how it actually works and how hard it is to make threats truly credible. So they're actually effective.
Yeah, that credibility is really the crux of it.
He even explores this idea of the tripwire, where a small commitment, almost like an automatic response, can deter a much larger opponent.
Right. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? The idea that a smaller force can sometimes hold back a much bigger one.
It's not just the size, it's about how clear and automatic the response will be. Like, if you trip this wire, this is exactly what's going to happen no matter what.
Exactly. It's about setting those clear expectations.
Now, Schelling also points out that a lot of the early discussion about deterrence wasn't necessarily coming from like a strong theoretical framework.
Yeah, he makes that distinction right. It was often more about reacting to immediate crises, policymakers trying to solve problems in the heat of the moment, journalists trying to make sense of things. It wasn't always grounded in solid theory.
Right. It's like trying to figure out the rules of a complicated game while you're in the middle of playing it, under pressure.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
And he has this interesting point about military organizations. They have all this practical experience with using force, obviously, but he suggests that they might not always be the best at theorizing about deterrence. Why do you think that is?
Well, he argues it's because their focus is mainly on the capabilities and use of military power, having the tools and the skills to actually wage war effectively, which is essential, but that focus can sometimes overshadow the more subtle parts of deterrence.
So it's not enough to just have the big stick, right? You need to understand how others will see that stick and how they'll understand the threats you're making.
Yeah, it's about the psychology of it.
It's the difference between being able to play an instrument really well and actually understanding how to compose a piece of music.
That's a great way to put it.
And Schelling also wrestles with the definition of theory in this whole area, right? Because it's not like physics or chemistry where you have these hard and fast laws.
All right, it's much more fluid.
So what does a good theory even look like when you're dealing with human behavior and conflict, which can be so unpredictable?
Well, for Schelling, a good theory helps to create a framework to make things clearer and also to help people communicate more effectively about these really important issues.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of developing a science of strategy. Now let's move to a more specific area, bargaining. Schelling sees bargaining as a key tactic in conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And he looks at bargaining in a really broad way. It's not just about formal negotiations, it also includes this tacit dimension where people are constantly watching and interpreting each other's actions.
Like a silent conversation, right?
Exactly. Where you're adjusting your expectations based on what you think the other person might do.
And one concept he really emphasizes is commitment.
Right, commitment.
It's about finding ways to show, really convincingly, that you're locked into a specific position, that you can't just back down easily. And limiting your own options can actually make you more powerful, which seems a bit counterintuitive.
Right, it's like you're tying your own hands, but it forces the other side to reconsider their approach. Schelling gives this great example, he says, $16,000 crossed my heart.
Aha, I love that.
It shows how trying to eliminate your own flexibility can actually influence the other person.
It all comes down to whether they believe you.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
And that depends on communication, or sometimes strategically not communicating.
Right, so how do you signal that you're not bluffing, that you really mean what you say? That's the key.
And communication can be so subtle, can't it? It's not just what you say, but how you say it and what you do.
Yeah, actions speak louder than words, as they say. And Schelling gets into the nitty-gritty of negotiation, too, the mechanics, as he calls them. Like, what happens if there are penalties for lying? Or what's the impact of offering a reward after someone has rejected your initial offer?
It's all about understanding how these little tactical choices can shift the whole dynamic.
Absolutely.
He also talks about the role of a bargaining agent. So if you're negotiating through someone else, their level of commitment or how committed they seem can really affect things.
Yeah, because they're representing you, right? Their actions reflect on you. And he also talks about the difference between negotiating in secret versus doing it publicly. Public negotiations can make commitments much harder to back away from.
Okay, let's move on to threats. In the context of strategy, threats aren't just about expressing anger or displeasure. They're meant to deter someone from doing something.
Right, they're meant to influence behavior.
But just saying you'll do something, if someone doesn't comply, that's not enough. We talked about this earlier with deterrence.
Yeah, credibility is crucial. Does the other person actually believe that you'll follow through? That you have the means and the will to carry out the threat?
And Schelling points out that threats can actually backfire if they're not credible. They can actually provoke the behavior you're trying to prevent.
Yeah, you have to be careful with threats.
This leads us to the idea of limited war, which might sound contradictory, but Schelling looks at it as a type of conflict where the goals and the methods are intentionally constrained.
Right, so there are rules, even in war. And what's interesting is that those limits often become the subject of bargaining, even if it's not explicitly stated.
So even without a formal agreement, there's this understanding of what's off limits, like an unspoken agreement.
Exactly. And communication is still important, even if it's indirect, like avoiding certain types of targets or not using certain weapons. It's a way of signaling your intentions and showing that you understand the limits.
It's a high-stakes game where you're trying to communicate without actually saying anything directly.
And hoping the other side understands the message.
Exactly. This brings us to tacit bargaining, which is fascinating. Schelling uses this example of two people who need to meet in a big city, but they haven't arranged a specific place.
The lost in the city scenario, it's a classic.
So where would they intuitively go? Like if I said, meet me in New York City, where would you go?
Well, probably Times Square. Or Grand Central Station, somewhere really obvious and central.
Exactly. That's tacit bargaining. You're coordinating without actually talking by focusing on these shared, prominent focal points.
Right. And Schelling applies this to much more complex strategic situations. Like, think about how countries in a conflict might avoid using nuclear weapons. There's no written agreement, but they both understand the catastrophic consequences. That shared understanding acts as a focal point, even though it's never explicitly stated.
So in these scenarios, the idea of winning and losing becomes more complicated, right?
Yeah, it's not always about defeating the other side. Sometimes it's about avoiding mutual destruction, just making sure everyone survives.
And Schelling also discusses this isolation paradox. It's the idea that even if someone suggests a compromise that seems good for everyone, both sides might reject it.
Yeah, because neither side wants to be the first to accept. They're afraid it'll make them look weak.
That's so interesting. It's counterintuitive. You'd think people would jump at a good solution.
Right, but it shows how psychology and strategy are intertwined. People are worried about looking weak or setting a precedent for future concessions. And then there's the whole issue of fairness. You know, if there's no direct communication, how do you figure out what a fair outcome would be?
And how do past actions or understandings shape what people expect will happen in the future. It's like this constant unspoken negotiation.
Absolutely.
And these focal points you mentioned, they're not just random, are they? They have specific qualities that make them stand out.
Right. Schelling argues that they're often simple, unique, or in some other way, obvious choices, like, easily recognizable landmarks in a war zone or historically important dates for ceasefires, things that both sides will naturally gravitate towards.
Okay, so Schelling's work is really pushing us beyond traditional ways of thinking about conflict. And this leads us to his ideas about reorienting game theory. What was his critique, and what did he propose?
So Schelling felt that traditional game theory, which focuses a lot on purely rational actors, was missing some really important aspects of real-world strategy. It assumes people are always making choices based on maximizing their own gains, like in a very logical, mathematical way.
Right, like a perfectly played game of chess.
Exactly. But Schelling argued that we need to consider the messier human side of things, like communication, expectations, psychology, all that. Real-world conflicts aren't like chess. They're much more complicated.
So he's saying that the outcome isn't just about what you do, it's about what everyone else does and what they think everyone else is going to do.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. And that's where the zero-sum game model falls short.
Because in a zero-sum game, if one person wins, the other person automatically loses. But Schelling is saying that's not always how it works in real life.
Right. Sometimes both sides can gain something, or both sides can lose something. And that means you need to understand the other player's perspective. What are they thinking? What are their motivations? What are they expecting you to do? Even if you're not directly communicating.
And he uses that great example of Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty, right, at the train station, each trying to outsmart the other.
Exactly. They're both trying to anticipate each other's moves, but without any direct contact.
And then there are games of coordination where the goal isn't necessarily to win, but to get everyone on the same page.
Right. It's like everyone driving on the same side of the road, and it doesn't really matter which side, as long as everyone's doing the same thing. The challenge is figuring out how to achieve that alignment, often without any explicit instructions.
He also mentions the role of roles and shared understandings within groups. So, like, if everyone knows their place and what's expected of them, it makes it easier to coordinate.
Yeah, think about a sports team. Each player has a role, and they know what the other player is supposed to be doing. That's how they coordinate so effectively, even without constantly talking to each other.
Right, it's like an unspoken understanding. And then there are the mixed motive games where things get really complex. There's both cooperation and competition at play.
Yeah, mixed motive games are fascinating. It's like there's an incentive to work together to get a good outcome for everyone, but there's also the temptation to act selfishly, even if it hurts the others.
So you're constantly weighing those two options.
Exactly. Schelling uses this example of two people dividing up the U.S. One starts in Cincinnati, the other in San Francisco. They can't communicate directly, so how do they decide where to draw the line? They end up relying on their shared knowledge of geography and what they think would be a reasonable division. It shows how, even without explicit negotiations, shared references and this idea of fairness can shape the outcome.
It's like they're both trying to be rational, but they're also influenced by their own perceptions and this sense of what's fair. And this all highlights Schelling's point that while mathematical models can be useful, they often miss these really important non-mathematical factors that drive real-world decisions.
Exactly.
So to really understand strategy, you have to look beyond just the numbers. You have to consider things like psychology, traditions, unspoken rules, all of that.
Right, you have to look at the bigger picture.
Okay, so a key part of being strategic is being able to clearly communicate your intentions and make sure people believe what you're saying. And that brings us to Schelling's discussion of enforcement, communication, and strategic moves.
Yeah, enforcement is fundamental. If you can't enforce agreements, then strategy becomes much less reliable.
Right, because there are no consequences for breaking the rules. And a strategic move, as Schelling defines it, is any action you take that's meant to influence what other people expect will happen and therefore influence their decisions. So you're shaping the situation proactively. And threats definitely fall into this category of strategic moves. But it's not just about saying what you'll do, it's about making that threat believable.
Right, it has to be credible. The other person has to believe you have the ability and the willingness to follow through.
And he also talks about promises as strategic moves. But making a promise believable, that can be just as hard as making a threat credible, if not harder.
Yeah, promises rely on trust. The other person has to believe that you have a good reason to keep your word. And Schelling goes into how difficult it can be to make promises truly binding, especially in situations where there aren't any strong legal frameworks or ways to hold people accountable.
Right, because what's stopping someone from breaking a promise if there are no consequences? And one really extreme example he uses is hostages. It's a pretty drastic way to make sure someone complies with your demands.
It is extreme, but it shows how creating shared vulnerability can be a powerful motivator. You're putting something valuable at risk and making it clear that it depends on the other person's actions.
So it gives them a very strong incentive to cooperate.
Exactly.
He also talks about the role of identification in strategy. So revealing something about yourself, like your preferences or limitations, can actually affect how other people see your threats and promises.
Right. So if you can show that you really care about carrying out a threat, maybe because of your reputation or your principles, it makes the threat more believable.
Mm.
Or if you show that you value a future relationship, it can make your promises of cooperation more credible.
Because you're showing them that you have something to lose if you break your word.
Exactly.
And finally, Schelling emphasizes that communication itself can be a strategic move. It's not just about conveying information, it's about the act of communication itself.
Yeah, how you communicate, when you communicate, what evidence you provide, all of that contributes to the message. It's about protecting confidence, showing your resolve, and shaping how the other person understands the situation and what you intend to do.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Schelling's work, it seems like the key takeaway is this. We need to move beyond these simple models of perfectly rational actors. We need to recognize the importance of communication, expectations, and all these subtle but powerful dynamics of strategic interaction.
Exactly. Whether we're talking about international relations, business negotiations, or even just everyday disagreements, Schelling's ideas are incredibly relevant.
And it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, in what situations might there be a lot more going on strategically than we realize at first glance? There's so much happening beneath the surface, all this tacit communication and subtle maneuvering.
It's a whole new way of looking at the world and how people interact.
It definitely is. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the strategy of conflict. I hope it's given you some new insights to think about.
It was a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Until next time.
See ya.